Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about organizational and occupational white-collar crime, and specifically we're going to delve into the idea of gender differences and also to an extent racial differences in white-collar offending, talking about a very specific white-collar crime study that was used to examine these differences. So gender differences in white-collar crime are typically based on the idea that men work in white-collar crime jobs at higher rates than women. Therefore, it logically kind of makes sense that men's rates of white-collar crime should be significantly higher than women's rates of white-collar crime. It also assumes that maybe as time has progressed and women have become more and more involved in corporate America, that maybe their share of white-collar crime has slowly been increasing as their roles in businesses and corporations increase. Now, when discussing approaches to white-collar crime, there are two main differences in the approaches. The first is an offender-based approach, and this basic argument is that you need to be in a position of wealth and power in order to be considered a white-collar criminal. If you are not one of the guys wearing white-collar shirts at work, you can't be a white-collar criminal. The other is an offense-based approach, which basically argues that it doesn't really matter who's committing the offense. The offense in and of itself is a white-collar offense. So, for example, an offender-based approach would argue that Medicare fraud can only be a white-collar crime if it's carried out by a doctor or a nurse, or an offender who works in the healthcare industry in the course of their job, versus an offense-based approach that would argue Medicare fraud, regardless of who does it, if it's the patient, if it's someone who's hacked into a system, is a white-collar crime, regardless of who does it. So using an offender-based approach, it seems as though white-collar crime is largely male-dominated. And that makes sense because, again, the vast majority of business executives and politicians are old white dudes, right? And so it stands to reason that if that's the only people that can be classified as that kind of criminal, then the vast majority of those crimes are committed by that person. However, if you use an offense-based approach, we can see that women and men's crime rates are much closer than originally thought. Not only are the crime rates closer, but Zeitz also found that women tended to commit white-collar crime for different reasons and motivations compared to men. So, for example, women might be embezzling money from work because they want to take care of a sick relative, whereas men might be trying to pay off a gambling debt or buy a boat. Other researchers have found that less women are present in corporate jobs in general, that men tended to work in groups absent women to commit white-collar crime, whereas women tended to work alone, and that women were typically less lucrative in their crimes. And that, to an extent, that last one really kind of makes sense, right? If women are trying to, for example, take care of a sick relative or pay a medical bill, once the medical bill's paid for, they're not going to keep committing crime. Whereas if men are trying to pay off a gambling debt, well, if they keep gambling, that's a problem. Or if it's all selfish motivations, there's always a bigger boat or a nicer airplane that needs to be purchased. So in the specific study that was looking at gender and racial differences in white-collar crime, 5 main hypotheses emerged. The first one was that the female share of corporate crime is low. Similarly, the female share of occupational crime is low, and these are both low compared to men's rates. Women are less likely to work in groups compared to men. Women's economic gains from crime are typically less than men, and men and women's motives for criminal involvement differ such that women tend to do it for others, whereas men tend to do it for themselves. So, what did we find out here? Well, results indicated that women committed postal fraud, credit card fraud, false claims, and embezzlement at moderate rates, and rates higher than we actually expected them to be committing these crimes. However, in all cases, most women were less than college educated, which is not typically a sign of class. So we had this idea that as women worked their way up the corporate ladder more, they would commit more and more crime. But in fact, what we found out is the vast majority of women who committed white-collar crimes were less than college educated. Interestingly, also, a lot of the white-collar crime that was done by people who were not actually working in a professional or occupational setting when committing these acts. So, for example, 30 to 40% of women who committed postal or credit fraud didn't actually work in the industry. They just happened to interact with the industry in some capacity. In looking at gender and race comparisons, non-white women actually committed white-collar crime at higher rates than non-white men. And so while white men maybe were committing white-collar crimes at slightly higher rates than white women, non-white women actually made up the difference, and we saw a reciprocal result there. Women were typically younger than men, less educated, and typically had dependents out of a marital context, which means that these were single mothers that were younger, less educated. The vast majority of men and women were not affluent, and about 20% of the women were on welfare or unemployment benefits. So a lot of the people that are committing these white-collar offenses are not wealthy individuals, right? Most of the women who committed white-collar crimes were actually clerical workers also. Men tended to be managers or administrators and typically used their positions of power to carry out their crimes, whereas women were not. And that's actually kind of a logical idea, right? So if most of them were clerical workers, even if they were committing white-collar crimes outside of their industries, like postal or credit fraud, they still had the resources to do it at work, right? If you are committing postal fraud, right, and you are a secretary or a clerical worker, you have access to envelopes and stamps all day at work where you can be committing your postal fraud and it looks like you're actually doing your job at work. Also, it kind of makes sense that it's the less affluent people committing the white-collar offenses because they're the ones that are around a lot of money all day. They're around these people in power. They're around these business executives, and yet they don't get to share in the wealth that these executives have. If you're working for a company that's making $100 or $200 or $300 million a year, if you're stealing $1,000 a month, does that really hurt the company? No. Is that potentially life-changing for you, though? Absolutely it is. $1,000 a month is a lot of money. And so there might be a motivation to do that. Also, if you are in a corporate environment where there is a high premium placed on appearance, they want you to wear nice clothes to work and nice shoes and make sure your hair and nails are done and make sure you wear nice jewelry. That all costs money. So embezzling money from the company or stealing money might be just viewed as a kind of quote-unquote cost of doing business, right? This is a business expense that I have if you want me to dress this way because you don't pay me enough to actually dress the way you want me to dress. Women also tended to act alone compared to men, who, while still mostly acting alone, did commit at least 30% of the white-collar crimes with some sort of accomplice. Also, the motivations for white-collar crime were different. Compared to men, women tended to admit guilt, take personal responsibility for their offense, provide stronger justifications for their crime, and express remorse. So women in general tended to apologize when they got caught, admit they did it, and actually have good reasons for committing crime, as opposed to, well, my boat wasn't as fast as my neighbor, so I got a new one, right? Women also tended to cite family need for justification of their offenses significantly more than men did. So what does this all mean taken together? Well, first of all, the female share of corporate crime being low is supported. However, the female share of occupational crime being low is somewhat mixed. In fact, in certain cases like embezzlement, women were committing embezzlement almost at the exact same rates as men were. Women were less likely to work in crime groups compared to men. That was supported. Women's economic gains from crime were less than men's. That was also supported. However, men's and women's motives for criminal involvement were not necessarily as different as anticipated. While a lot of the motivation was to help others, it wasn't the primary or even the largest motivation for women. And so that difference was present. And so this is all really, really helpful when starting to think about white-collar crime as criminal behavior and saying, well, we maybe need to start changing our definition of who is the white-collar criminal, and instead of just focusing at the corporate offices, looking and seeing, is there something criminogenic about these other levels and other areas that maybe we need to address in society? As always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to drop a comment down below, and I will respond to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much for tuning in.